Good morning. I think I'm live. Okay. Um, this is my Sunday school class. I'm Doug Griffin. This is Sunday school. It's January 31st. And we are in the book of Genesis, chapter 22. This is part three of Genesis chapter 22. Um, the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac actually begins in Genesis chapter 21 and ends where it begins. Abraham has gone to Abimelech. Abimelech is a title more like Pharaoh. We talk about Pharaoh as though that's his first name. Pharaoh came down, but that Pharaoh is a type of king. Abimelech is a type of king in this southern Israel country. He made a Abraham makes a deal with Abimelech, saying, "This well here, I've dug this well, and I'm going to give you seven sheep to really guarantee that you know this is my well. And we're going to call this place Beersheba, which means the place of the oath, the place of the seven, because he gave him seven lambs, the seven oaths, or the seven sheep, or the seven, Beersheba, right here. This is belonging to me. This well belongs to me. That becomes significant way later in Israel's history, like 40 years ago. Um, Beersheba was inhabited by the Peleshti people. They're from the Aegean Sea, and they sailed there. They were the Peleshti. Later they called themselves the Pelestians, and that became the Palestinians. And so the Palestinians were in that southern part of Israel, and they eventually named that whole place Palestine once the Jews left. And when the Jews came back 50, 60 years ago, the Palestinians were like, no, this is our land. And Abraham's like, no, I made a deal. That's my land. And like, no. But they ended up, the Jews ended up with the land anyway because they made a deal. Okay, so Abraham leaves Abimelech, and a few years later, God speaks to him. Genesis 22, verse 1, it says, came to pass after these things, after that whole ordeal with Abimelech and Abraham establishing that Beersheba is mine. After these things, God did test, prove, tempt, really prove Abraham is the correct translation of the word, and said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. He says this three times, and that here I am is an act of surrender. Here I am, I surrender. Okay, so we've gone over this, and we're going to finish the chapter today. In verse 7 through 8, it says that Isaac spoke to Abraham. So remember, God speaks to Abraham and says, I want you to go and sacrifice. Offer up your son. Offer him up. Okay. So he says, okay. And God's doing this just to prove, not so that he can find out, but to prove that Abraham's going to put obedience to God above everything else. It's what messed Saul up. It's what messed a lot of people up because they put the people above God's word. And these are people who clearly heard God. I understand if you weren't, I don't know if God said to do that or not. God's not holding you responsible if you're not clear. But if you're clear that God has spoken, and yet you choose what somebody else is asking you to do or telling you to do or persuading you to do over what God is telling you, it's not a good thing. So he wants to see Abraham, even if I tell you to sacrifice your son, heard over everything else. So they're walking along in verse 7 and 8 of Genesis 22. It says, Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father? And he said, here I am. Same thing where he's saying that he said to God, he's saying to God, I'm open to you. Here I am, son, whatever you want. And he says, look, I see the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb? I don't see a lamb. I know you told us we were going to have a burnt offering. Where's the lamb? And Abraham says, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. He literally said, Elohim Jireh. God is the provider. Elohim Jireh. This will come into play later when he calls the place Jehovah Jireh. So there's a reason why he first says Elohim Jireh, which is the general name for God of all the earth, and Jehovah Jireh is the name for our covenant relationship with God. God saying, I am God of all the earth, but there are certain people who've chosen to make a covenant with me personally. So first he just says Elohim Jireh, God is the provider. Now in verse 9, starting from there, and they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there. And this was Moriah, where later the temple was built, in this mountain range where later Jesus was crucified. And God is teaching a lesson. So as we go through this, we have to remember that Moses is writing this down and reading it to the people as they have come out of bondage for 400 years. They've been in Egypt for 400 years. And all they've been hearing is Egyptian stories and Egyptian tales and Egyptian ways of thinking, which is all about death. Death. Egyptians worshipped death. They built great pyramids because they couldn't wait to die. And so God was teaching them to choose life. And so God's telling Moses, I want you to record all of this. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these first 5 books. Write all the words of my law, write this history so the people can learn their history and learn about me. So everything that is in Genesis is really a lesson for the people that he wanted them to repeat over and over and over, and we'll see why. But he wanted to repeat these stories so they can get ingrained. So they came to the place which God had told them of, and Abraham built an altar there. Now, God's very specific about his altars when you build an altar. Exodus chapter 20, verse 24, this is Moses giving the rules for altar building. So when they hear the story that Abraham built an altar, they know exactly what kind of altar he built. It says, an altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I record my name, every place that I call my own, every place where I say, that's mine, build an altar to me there. But it's got to be of earth. Why? Why of earth? Okay. He says, and then my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. So if you take the stone and you start chopping away and make it in your image and how you think it should look, then you're profaning it because it's all about your work. Look what I've done. And so he just wants you to build it of earth and stone that God has made, that he's made available, that you haven't touched. Build an altar of what I have done, God says, not of what you have done. And we like to build an altar of what we have done, so we can pat ourselves in the back. Look what I did for God. I'm so wonderful. And God's like, then whatever you put on the altar, I'm not going to accept, because that altar is all about you. And God's saying, it's all about me. So he doesn't want, if you've chopped on, I don't want it. So just look around and see what I have created and build an altar out of what I have made. And so Abraham built an altar of what was available there. Now he took the wood and he carried the wood with it. And in fact, remember, he put it on Isaac and made Isaac carry the wood, because that was a type of Jesus carrying his cross as he went up to be sacrificed. But the altar they built out of what was there that God had made. Then he puts the wood on the altar, right? So, here it says in verse 9, the second part of verse 9, wood in order, and then he bound Isaac. Now, these details Moses is putting in because he's painting a picture that he wants people to repeat over and over. So Isaac carried his own wood, then Isaac was bound. In John 18:12, when they're talking about Jesus, it says, then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And you'll see in this description of what Abraham's doing with Isaac, God is painting the same picture of what's going to happen to Jesus, because he wants them to say these stories over and over and over again. Okay, he carried his wood, he was bound, and so that when they see the same thing happening with Jesus, they'll go, oh, that's the story we've been told, and now I can see it, so that they'd have no excuse to miss it. So because Jesus is there saying, hey, I'm the Messiah, and they're like, nah. But when he's so carefully fulfilling all of these types that are in the Bible, the people were supposed to be able to look at that and go, yes, I see that. I see that that's the story I've been telling my children, and now it's acting out in front of me. So, still in verse 9. So he took the wood, he built the altar, he bound Isaac, and it says, and he laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now in 1 Peter 2:23, oh, the reason I'm about to bring that up is because Isaac is now getting on this altar, right? He's been bound by his father, and there's no record in him of him fighting it at all. He's just, okay, whatever you say, Father, okay, I'll get on that altar. You can bind me. And there's no struggle. He's just submitting, like, okay, I'm trusting you, Father, that whatever's happening, I'm putting my life in your hands. Father, I'm putting your life in your hands. And that's the picture of Isaac just submitting. In 1 Peter 2, it says, talking about Jesus, was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he committed to himself to God, who judges righteously. He just said, okay, I submit myself to, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. So Jesus was like, if it's possible, let this cup pass me by, but nevertheless, I submit. So he didn't fight. He stood there, didn't say a word. And that's the same thing that Isaac did. Now, Moses didn't know what Jesus was going to do. Moses didn't live in Jesus' time and then say, oh, let me write a story about that. God is leading him to a specific way so that they can have this picture of Isaac who submitted, who carried his own wood up, who laid on the altar and never fought, so that Jesus, when Jesus does that, he doesn't fight. There's a reason Jesus is doing that. It's like, I'm acting out that story that began. This is the story that began the covenant, and I'm finishing it. So in verse 10, it says, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. So why was it important that Abraham sacrifices Isaac? And I call this because often in life we are called to sacrifice our Isaacs. Okay. God, the test is for Abraham, let go, even though I promised this to you, even though I said in Isaac, your seed will be called and the earth will be blessed. Can you let go of it? And it's important for us to let go of our Isaacs, the things that we're dreaming about, the things that God has planted in our hearts, that job that we want, that thing that we're praying about, that career, that promotion, that car. There are things that we just set our hearts on, and they can become more important than God. That it becomes the focus of our life. I've got to get that new car. I've got to get that person. I've got to get into that college, and we can block out God because we're so narrowly focused on a particular thing. It becomes very important to us, right? The most important thing of our life, that we get that thing, whatever that is. And so it's our grip on it begins to tighten. So if we possess that put in our heart, if we possess too tightly, God forces us to let go of it for a time, because it's his. He placed his desire in our. Then it becomes ours, and it does. It becomes more important than God. God's testing Abraham right here. Will you give up Isaac, your only son? Will you let it go and just obey me? Which is more important? Are you going to say, no, Lord, this is my child. You gave me this child, and it's mine. How are you going to fulfill the promise? Are we that type of person where we're holding on to that thing so tightly? God says, oh, I got to make you let it go. I got to make you let it go, because you're exalting it, but you're not even hearing me correctly. And there are things that we hold on to. There are people we hold on to. That person, God, and God says that I'm going to make you let go of that, because you're not even hearing me. And I've seen that recently. I've seen people not be able to hear God clearly. Christians just not, because they're so focused on, they think they know what God wants. No, God, and they end up fighting God. God's saying, no, I'm not going to do that right now. I'm not going to do that in the way you think I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do, and like, no, God, you're going to make, and they can't hear God anymore because they're so narrowly focused. We become so narrow. I know what God wants, and then it's like, God, like, actually, ironically, you don't know what I want. So I'm going to make you let that go. So he makes the dream die for a while. Whatever it is, again, that house, that, you know, college for my child, or like, let go. I'm going to send you a notice that your child was not accepted to that college because you made that college more important than hearing my voice. And God is constantly putting his servants to that sort of test. Are you going to believe me? Are you going to hold on to that thing? So it's important that Abraham say, even though you gave me this promise, even though, Lord, you said all this is going to happen, if you're saying let it go, I'm good because it's yours anyway. That child that came through me, that's yours. I'm not going to, no, I'm going to have to let go. Whatever that thing is, I have to let it go uh, because it's becoming too important. And so I'm putting it above all things. And God just, Abraham, you got to let it go. Will you let it go? So that's the test that he goes through. James chapter 2, verse 21, James addresses this. Now we got to remember that James is the brother of Jesus. Okay, now really his cousin who they took into the house, right? When Mary's sister's husband passed away, then Mary's husband was obligated to take those kids into the house. So it was really Jesus's cousin, but they called him brother. Okay. So James is the brother, cousin, who didn't hang around Jesus. James thought Jesus was crazy until after he died, and then suddenly James got converted, found religion, and got a place of honor. Well, you Jesus' brother, but he didn't listen to the teachings of Jesus. So James has a very interesting view about faith and works, and so we have to always take what James is saying, weighing against the background. But he has some good points. We have to weigh where James is coming from. And his point is, if you really have faith, then let's see it. You can't. Oh, I have faith all the time. Do you really? Well, then why won't you tithe? Then, if you have faith that God's going to supply your needs, why won't you go ahead and forgive that person if you have faith? You know what? So James is all about, okay, you talk about faith, but let me see some works. Not that works get you to heaven, but that work. You know, if you really believe God, are you going to? Let's see it. That's James's thing. So in James chapter 2, verse 20 and then 21 and then 22. Okay, it says, but do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac's son on the altar? Now, again, he doesn't mean that's how he got to heaven through works. He just means God could tell. God, it's like, oh, there's the proof that you really believe what you say. And if somebody says, "Oh, that chair will hold your weight," yesterday, some people, that ladder, will that ladder hold your weight? Well, if you believe on it, you're going to step on that ladder, and you know who I'm talking to out there. And so, you'll get on that ladder and you'll change that light bulb. But if you don't believe that ladder is going to hold your weight, then you won't do it. And so we'll know what you believe by what you do. And so Abraham was justified, he's saying, by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar. That's when we knew that Abraham believed God and trusted God above all else. Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works, faith was made perfect, or was made mature. So when we believe God, we go ahead and do those things that he says. When we just talk about it but don't do it, then the question, do you really believe it? Because I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it. So Abraham raises because remember, he told the servants that he left at the bottom of the hill, oh, we'll be back. Because he thought, well, I guess God's going to raise him from the dead, but I am going to do what God told me to do. And Abraham had really matured in the 40 years that we've been following him. He really matured, because the first thing he did was lie. Remember when he got to Egypt? That's not my wife. I don't know her. But he had really changed. And now he's, okay, God, whatever you say, I'll sacrifice my son. So that's how his faith has matured. That's what James is saying. Verse 11 of Genesis chapter 2, 22. And the angel of the Lord called to him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Again, this is the third time that Abraham says this phrase in this chapter. He says the first time God calls him, Abraham, I want you to go offer your son. Here I am. When his son says, hey, Dad, here I am. And then the angel calls again. Here I am. He's saying, I'm open, I'm available. It's not by coincidence that Abraham confirms the Lord 3 times. Peter denied the Lord 3 times. There's this thing about threes that are in the Bible. Um, so when he says, here I am, I'm open, because this night's about to come down. And verse 12, and the angel said, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God. Now that question, now that translation, now I know, is interesting because that's not what literally it's now I knew, or you could have translated now I have known. You go, well, what does that mean? And the translators said, I don't understand what now I knew or now I have known. What does that mean? So they just translated it now I know. They said, well, God must have messed up.
Yeah.
But he says, now it is known. I already knew it, and now you know it. That's why he said, now I knew. Now it's clear. Now it's clear what I knew. Now it's clear what I have known is probably the best translation of that. Now it is clear what I have known, that you fear God. Because God knows our hearts, but sometimes he has to put us through something so that we'll know, so that we'll get it. Wow, I really don't trust God at all. Or wow, I guess I really do trust God. So that's why when you have good teachers, that's why the test is administered. Again, I learned, and in the way I've taught was, here's the final exam I'm giving to you the first day, so that you will know everything that you're going to have to tackle in this class. So day 1, here's the final, and then you go through. I only got 10% of these right. Yes, but look, 10% on day 1, and now you know the other 90% that you're going to have to learn. And I'm going to give you the very same test on the last day, and you'll have all the right answers. Well, I mean, I'll change a couple things around, but you'll this is how much you'll know. And so every so often I give you a test so you can see where you're at. Oh, now I know 30%. Oh, look, now I know 50%. Now I know 70%. That's what the test is for, so that you can see where you are at. I, as the teacher, I'm watching you. I'm asking questions, and I'm seeing that blank look on your face. I know where you're at, but you don't know. You don't know that you better go home and study. I know, but you don't. And God's the great teacher. He knows, but we're not clear. So he puts us through certain things so we can look at it and go, oh, look, I didn't panic today. I waited, and look, God came through. And normally I would have had 15 beers and jumped off the roof. But I just said, well, God's going to provide. And I relaxed. Look, I guess I have grown, right? I was waiting for that rent money, and I didn't panic this time. And right, exactly. I'll drink 10 beers and jump off the balcony, and that's better.
Amen.
So, but I'm getting better, right? And as not panicking, or I didn't get angry when that person said that to me, or whatever the thing is, whatever the test is for us. We see, oh, look, God is doing a work in me, and I'm getting better. And so the test is for us to see what God is already knows. So that's why the translation is now I know. I mean, now I knew. I love that. Now I knew, or now I have known, but now it is clear what I have known, that you fear God, seeing as thou hast not withheld thy son. Then he says it this way, thine only son from me. So now he's back to the story of Jesus, as Abraham is having, God is having Moses write this story, right? And so this whole part, see, you did not withhold your son, your only son from me. And when people repeat this story, and that was mostly how these books were passed from person to person, was orally, right? You'd hear these stories over and over, what happened to Abraham. You'd hear these verses over and over, and they paint a picture. And so this whole thing about giving up thy son, thine only son, in John 3:16, we all know this verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life. There's a reason why Jesus was saying this, why God, would say, this is my son, behold my only son, in whom I'm well pleased. And they go, ooh, that only son story. I know that. I'm familiar with that. That's Abraham sacrificing. I'm recognizing this, and that's what he wants us to do. God is not mysterious like we want him to be. He keeps doing things in a certain way so that we'll recognize him. oh, look, oh, there's God again. I could tell that was God again, because in my life, that's how God does things. In my life, that's how God's, oh, that dream I had, or, oh, that I just had that funny feeling. I recognize that again. And he repeats certain patterns in each person's life. And he does it different for every person so that you'll recognize his voice. He wants us to recognize him. So he's repeating this only son thing so that the Jews would hear that over and over and over. And in Romans chapter 8, verse 31 to 32, Paul, in writing to the Romans, is explaining that very same concept to them. He says, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? If God's on our side, what do we have to fear? And here's why. He says, he who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? So God didn't spare his son. God didn't hold him back and say, no, I can't sacrifice my son. He gave up his son and put him on the wood, and the son freely said, okay, God, whatever you say, you're okay, Father, I'm just going to submit to your will. If God did that, won't he freely give us everything? We don't have to even work. It's like, don't sweat it. If God gave up his only son, won't he also with that freeless give us everything else? He didn't withhold his son, just like Abraham didn't withhold his son. Abraham didn't say, no, but he's my son. He gave him up, and that was a type of God giving up his son. So in verse 13 of Genesis chapter 22, so when Abraham lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. Right behind him there was a ram there all along, which God had hid that from Abraham's eyes, and now it's there. And God does that. It's like, hey, don't panic. Look what I got for you over there. But we got to be open. If we're open, if Abraham doesn't go up there in the first place, he never discovers the ram, right? We have to be open and say, okay, God, I'm just going to be obedient to you, even though it looks hard, even though what you're asking me to sacrifice, I'm going to do it. And then we turn around and go, oh, look, God's provided. Look, I didn't see God put this ram there before I even got here. And he'll do that for us. He'll put that provision there, but we have to be obedient and walk up the hill. We have to do what he's asking us to do, and then we run into the ram. So yes, God does not chase us down. He asks us to be obedient, and then we get the reward. Okay, so Abraham, it says, went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh. Now remember, he told his son Elohim Jireh, God, the general name for God, provides, but he's calling this place Jehovah Jireh because that's the covenant name that God says, I want you to call me Jehovah whenever we talk about the covenant that I've made specifically with you. And when we enter into Jehovah, when we enter into covenant relationship with God, not just, oh yeah, there's a God up there somewhere, but when we do what Abraham does and we sacrifice, and we'll talk about what our sacrifice is, then we enter into that covenant relationship with him. And so that's why he changed the name of the place to Jehovah Jireh, which means God will provide. Now, this is interesting. In this verse, he says, so we call the name of the place Jehovah Jireh, which we know means Jehovah Jireh, God provides, as it is said to this day. So here's what they say about that place. In the mount of the Lord, it shall be seen. And that's a proverb that they began to say, meaning when we're in need, if we go to the mountain of God, if we go to God in the mountain of God, then we will see his deliverance. His deliverance will be seen. So it's in the mount of the Lord, and that's figurative language, right? Metaphorical language. We don't have to literally go to a mountain, but you can if you want. Go to, because some people like going up to the mountains and I got to get away from the city and I can hear God better. But it's figuratively, you can go to the mountain in your living room, but it's just, I'm going to the mount of God right now, and I'm going to, all these problems, let me just spend some time on the mountain of God and in prayer, and then you'll see. He says, in the mount of God it will be seen. His deliverance, the answer is seen when we go to that mountain and spend that time with him. But thank God we don't have to go to a literal mountain every time we want to talk to God. You can be in your car, you can be at the 7-Eleven. You can close your eyes and just say, Lord, I just need to hear you right now. I'm gonna go to your mountain. And that's where we'll see the salvation. Okay, so verse 15 says, and the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven a second time. Because first time he says, hey, don't kill your son. Second time he says, verse 16, And he said, by myself I have sworn, saith the Lord. So let me straighten out one thing. The angel of the Lord, angel means messenger of the Lord. And sometimes God would show up literally. Well, he'd send a messenger, and out of that messenger's mouth, God was speaking. Like I've given that example about out of my phone, my sister-in-law could be speaking. Out of my phone, my wife is speaking. That is her voice coming out of the phone, but she's not the phone. But that is her voice coming out of it, right? So when God would send an angel or a messenger, that's what angel means, messenger. Sometimes he literally would speak out of that angel's mouth, just like it's my wife literally speaking out of the phone, right, to me. And sometimes he would simply tell the messenger what to say. And Gabriel would show up and says, well, here's what God told me to tell you. But it wasn't literally God's voice, but it was God's message he was delivering. In this case, when it says the messenger of the Lord called on Abraham, it's literally God's voice coming out of that angel, God's words coming out of that angel. And it says, and so he says in verse 16, by myself I have sworn, saith the Lord. I mean, I've sworn on myself. I bet on myself. I made the covenant with myself. I made the oath with myself. And in Hebrews chapter 6, he's explaining that concept to us. In Hebrews chapter 6:16, he says, for men indeed swear by the greater, an oath for confirmation. And for them, there's an end of all dispute. So men swear by somebody greater. I swear by whoever that if I don't, I will keep my word, because that person who's greater will force them to keep it, right? And so that's why they swear by someone greater than themselves. In their day, that they would always swear by the king or the temple. They'd swear by something greater than themselves that they knew would come down and force them to keep their word. So we might have a judge or a police officer, in our day, that when we say, okay, I'm gonna pay this fine, and if you don't show up, we know someone greater than ourselves is gonna come looking for us and take us off to jail. So we still have that in our society. When we promise to do something, we know if we don't keep our agreement, someone greater than ourselves is gonna come and force us to keep that agreement. But in verse 17 of Hebrews 6, it says, thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, the unchangeableness of his promise. So God, he's going to show you this can't be broken. And here's the proof. In verse, it says he confirmed it by an oath, by two immutable things, himself. You remember when God split those animals in half, and there was smoking fire on one side and there's fire on one side and smoke on the other? He's making this oath with himself. We couldn't keep it, so he made it. I said, I'm making it with myself. And so by myself I'm sworn, and I'm unchangeable. So there's no one greater than me, so to enforce it. So I'm keeping it with myself, so you don't have to worry about it. And he says, in which it is impossible for God to lie, so that we might have strong consolation. Like we don't have to worry. If God said it, he's going to do it, because he swore by himself. So we who have fled for refuge to lay hold to the hope set before us. So we fled our past life, is what he's talking about in Hebrews chapter 6. We have fled our past life, and we're laying hope in God. So that's what we gave up. We gave up our past life to lay hold of what God is promising us, and we know he's going to come through because he swore by himself. So he emphasizes the Abraham here in verse 16 of Genesis 22. God emphasizes and says, by myself I have sworn. And because you have done this thing and has not withheld thy son, thine only son, so you triggered it because you obeyed me. Because you've done that, here's what's going to happen. In blessing, verse 17, in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. So because you have done this, because you've shown your obedience, and again, he didn't do anything, actually. He just obeyed God, and he was about to do it, but God says, that's enough. You've shown me that you are putting me above all else, that you're willing to sacrifice. And because of your sacrifice here that you've shown me, that's why all this is going to happen. So how do we get in on those blessings? Because Abraham is blessed now. Abraham, like, Abraham, it's you've shown me your faith. Remember James, faith without works is dead. You've shown me that you believe me, that you're willing to sacrifice all for me. How do we get on in this? We get because so we have to get on the altar. We get on the altar. But you know how it says, make yourselves a living sacrifice. We say, okay, I'm laying down before you, Lord. I'm letting go of my life. I'm letting go of my will, my words, my how I think it should happen. And I'm gonna be obedient to you. And that's all he's asking us to do is saying, okay, I'm getting on the altar with that with Isaac. I am laying down and saying, Lord, you're my Lord, because a lot of so-called Christians never make Jesus their Lord. They make him their savior. You're my rescuer, and they depend on him to rescue when they're in trouble. Lord, help me. Jesus, help me. Never make him their Lord. They never say, okay, you're in charge. Now, he's their Lord on Sundays because they know how to act in church. But as soon as they get in the parking lot, he's no longer their Lord. And the whole rest of the week, we do what we want, we say what we want, we go where we want, we live how we want, and we're not sacrificing ourselves and saying, Lord, I'm not going to choose my way, I'm going to choose your way. And that was that was the test for Abraham. Are you going to do what you want and hold on? Or are you going to let go and let God determine and be obedient to him? So I remember Paul said, it's no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. There are many things I could say. Jesus said this, many things I could say, many things I could do, because I want to tell you off right now. I want to make you a crispy critter right now, Jesus would say, because he could have called down fire, but he says, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to be obedient. If God hadn't told me to say anything back to you, I'm just going to keep quiet. And it's that sort of attitude that allows God to work in us. The more we let go of different areas in our lives, then God's able to move in. Now, of course, the cool thing is if we don't let go, God will force us to let go. He'll blow up that car. He'll burn up that church. That chapel where my friend was going to get married, and God tried to stop him like 3 times, burnt up that church. But anyway, he'll just force you. You know, that good thing is the Bible says God has begun to work in us, and he will bring it to pass. So he'll start a work, and then he'll bring it to pass. But just knowing it's the letting go that causes the work to happen easier on us if we just willingly let go. But he'll just make you let go. But the more we let go and okay, God, not my will, not my way, your way, then then we just let go of ownership of the universe. God, you own the universe. They're yours. I don't have to control everything. You're in control. And it helps us just to relax. And that's what Abraham did. He just let go. And he says, because you've done this, because you've sacrificed, you're Isaac that you're holding on to, but you were willing to let it go. Now I'll be able to just flood you with all sorts of things. And that's the proof that James is asking for. If you believe, then let go of worry, let go of anger, let go of, God's got this. You don't have to worry. God's up all night trying to figure stuff out. So why do I have to be up all night? It's like, well, both of us don't need to be up. I'm going to bed. So we just have to, God, you got it. You've got it. And I'm going to obey you. And the more often I obey you, I find the reward. The more often I go to the mountain of the Lord and just obey you, then there's the ram in the bush. But I'm not going to find that ram until I obey you. And so you're going to find one way or other to get me up that hill. It's better when we go willingly. But either way, God is going to do the work. But if we can the more we can cooperate and the more we let go, the more peace we find. That'll keep us in perfect peace when our mind is focused constantly on the Lord. Then, that's a good peace. It's not a perfect peace when we focus on ourselves and then focus on God, focus on ourselves, but when we just focus on God and say, okay, God, you got this. And that's the kind of perfect peace we need. So, verse 19, so Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together back to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelt in Beersheba for a long time. And this is basically the end of Abraham's story. God moves on to Isaac. Abraham, toward the end of his life, he had really reached the place where he was just totally, and we don't have to wait till the ends of our life. You know, we can do it early, and just learn to just be in that peace of God. So Abraham went back to Beersheba because that was his well, even though the Palestinians were eventually going to say, no, that's my well. And you'll see, Isaac's going to fight with Abimelech over whose well that is, and that fight continues to this day.
Well,
But Abraham was in peace. Like, I'm not going to worry about it. God's going to make it all work out, and we could find that peace when we lay down and relax and say, God, I'm letting go. I'm letting go of all my Isaacs, all the things that I think I have to make happen a certain way. I'm just going to trust you. And God, he comes through every time because he swore by himself. So have I not said it? Will I not do it? He says, if I've said it, I'm going to do it. So we have to learn to trust it. So thank you for tuning in today. You're not really tuning. I keep thinking there's a tuner like it's in television from the 50s. Thanks for streaming me or whatever. I don't know what this technology is. But thanks for watching. Hey. And I will talk to you. I will see you. I won't see you. Okay. See next Sunday. Well, we'll continue in Genesis chapter 23. And also, some of you also listen in on Wednesdays at 7 for the Bible study where we're in Matthew chapter 24. And it's a good Bible study. So God bless you. I'm inviting everyone to, if you're a member of Good Shepherd, at 11 o'clock, Pastor Grimm will be on. And he's got a good sermon plan. So please make sure you listen for that. And to everyone, God bless you. Amen. And